So GSP just retired. One of the greatest careers of all time. I would say the greatest, in my opinion. Sliced through 3 divisions of fighters, from Hughes and BJ to Fitch and Koscheck's era, and eventually to Condit, Diaz, and controversially Hendricks. People can dispute the greatest of all time, but for me he is without question the greatest champion the sport has ever seen. In his long reign at welterweight, he approached every new opponent like they were his toughest yet, and having invariably disposed of them, he usually responded to questions regarding what's next with the same line: I want to fight the best in a division. Above any longtime champion I can think of, George always maintained a clear desire to prove over and over that he was unquestionably the greatest fighter in his division. He was a platonic ideal, the measuring stick by which champions should be assessed. But George didn't simply retire. As he announced his departure from the sport, he also teased the public with the prospect of his return to the cage. He's been very vocal about having wanted the Khabib fight. In fact, that piece of information has been front and center, which caused many to ask the question, is this a sincere retirement or is it a clever negotiation tactic? To get a sense of what might be going on here, it's worth revisiting the most drawn-out and complex fight negotiation of George's career. I'm going to revisit the negotiations that preceded the Bisping fight, with 3 questions in mind. What did George want? What did he get? And how did he get it? In April 2016, GSP announced he was in talks with the UFC to return to the sport. The major sticking point in the negotiation was that prior to leaving the UFC there was no Reebok deal in place. So George, who had a number of big sponsors, would take a huge financial hit under the terms of his old deal. Naturally, he felt this was grounds for renegotiation.
So when I was on contract back in the day, the Reebok deal was not in place.
Yeah.
So now because of the Reebok deal, it changed a lot of things in my contract. We need to renegotiate maybe a new contract because I'm not allowed to wear my sponsors anymore and I lose money. But, it depends how it's going to go down with UFC and, it's a whole contract, so we'll see what's going to happen.
At the time, he didn't call anyone out, but he made it clear that another title reign was not a priority. This time, he was looking for the biggest fights, the biggest names.
I want to fight the guys who's the best, who's the biggest name,
Mm-hmm.
You talked to me about fighting Robbie Lawler. I don't even know if it's going to be Robbie Lawler who's going to have the title when I come back. And if I'm going to fight for the title, I don't even know that.
So at this point, the only clear demand was that George wanted a new contract to compensate him for lost earnings. Outside that, he was looking for a big fight. In June 2016, that big fight presented itself when Bisping shocked the world by smashing the fuck out of Rockhold to snatch the middleweight crown. 10 days later, the first mention of a Bisping-George matchup came up on the MMA Hour.
But what about Michael Bisping versus George St-Pierre? Has that come across your radar at all?
So, and of course, the numbers would be fantastic with George St-Pierre. He's a massive proven draw. And at the end of the day, we're all trying to generate as much money as possible.
A week later, George answered a challenge. And for the first time since announcing his return, set his sights on an opponent in a real concrete manner.
Look, Ariel, there's 2 things that I'm very proud of.
Yes.
There's my title, my welterweight title that I won. And then there's another record that I hold for the most win in UFC history. And now I have someone who's challenging me for it, is Michael Bisping. If it's a fight that the fans and the UFC want to make, they got my number. They can call my agent, no problem.
When George settled on Bisping, he was very clear throughout the whole negotiation that was the fight he wanted. He remained relatively steadfast on the matter. The only time he seriously considered other opponents was while Bisping was signed to fight Hendo. In my view, this crystal clarity was a crucial part of the negotiation. So at this point, George wants a new contract, and he wants to challenge Bisping for the middleweight title. The UFC were initially opposed to his plans. Assuming George is thick as shit, Dana took to the media to try to immaturely goad George into setting all his demands aside in order to prove to the world he's still got a pair of balls swinging between his legs. But while Dana was playing tiddlywinks, George was playing chess, and he wasn't about to get baited by an obvious appeal to his ego.
George St-Pierre doesn't have that I want to be a world champion attitude anymore. Yeah. He doesn't have that drive and that desire that he once had. And if you don't have that, no, you should not fight. Is that a negotiating tactic?
He doesn't know anything about me. He doesn't know. I'm a smart guy. I'm not the kind of guy you're gonna say that, okay, I'm gonna sign if I'm gonna fight for a peanut. No. But I'm gonna tell him something like to Dana. It's like, let me fight once. And you'll see in the first minute of the fight that what you just said is wrong.
And George even alluded to the gamesmanship of the negotiation.
It's like a game, you know, he's doing his game, I'm doing mine, and we work for the best of our interests. But let me fight once, you'll see.
The two parties continue to trade shots in the media, with Dana questioning the heart of St-Pierre. At this point, the whole tone of the negotiation indicated that Dana wasn't taking George seriously and felt he could be easily pushed into a raw deal. And so George's next move was to show the promotion he was serious. His lawyer offered the UFC a deadline for a fight offer, and when the deadline wasn't met, he terminated George's contract.
Where do you stand right now?
Well, right now, I'm free agent. You hear it right? I'm free agent. My lawyer terminated the contract with the UFC.
Of course, the UFC disputed the termination, but my guess is George was simply demonstrating a willingness to walk away from the whole situation with no deal. Let the UFC know he wasn't prepared to cave on his demands. Negotiation 101. Be prepared to walk away. This tactic did appear to work, and it represented a turning point in the tone of the negotiation. In October, George sat down with the new owners and squashed his beef with Dana. They didn't reach a deal, but they were now negotiating, and Dana dropped the childish mind games and pointless shit-slinging. That same month, Bisping managed to survive his ordeal with Hendo, and he promptly turned his attention to George, who responded with this.
Nothing would make me more happy in the world to fight you in Toronto, Michael. Last week I met with Harry and I made peace with Dana. I tried to resolve things, but unfortunately, right now, it's not happening. Hopefully, things will change soon. Thank you.
A few weeks later, a second lawyer reiterated their strong stance and George's willingness to walk away with no deal. GSP doesn't need the UFC. If the new owners, William Morris IMG, don't want him back and they try to block him from fighting elsewhere, he can take the legal battle or decide to walk away and do other things. But despite not coming to terms with the UFC, critically, George continued to keep Bisping on the hook. From here on out, he was basically single-minded on who he wanted to fight. And in my opinion, this was a critical part of the negotiation. George was playing two games at once. Show the UFC he's prepared to leave, while simultaneously keeping Bisping interested enough in his return to hold on to the belt long enough for GSP to sort his contract out.
But it's up to them. And like I said, it has to be against someone that I think can elevate me. That's why I was very excited about fighting Michael Bisping. I'm very confident I'm gonna beat Michael Bisping and I'm gonna finish him. And I'm the George St-Pierre that you knew before is much better now. If you ask all my training partner, everybody, I have time to tune up a lot of things, and that's why I was so excited. But it did not happen, and you know, it's just very frustrating for me.
GSP may as well have been waving a big pair of red panties right under Bisping's nose. And this is one of the genius parts of George's strategy. He didn't even have a contract sorted, but he kept his focus solely on Bisping. This sent the count a clear message. The money fight is within your grasp. And Bisping reacted by completely stalling his division. In January 2017, he announced his return would be delayed because of what sounded like a possibly spurious or at least unnecessary surgery. I actually found out just recently I gotta have a knee surgery. Nothing major, just a cleanup. I got a slightly torn meniscus, couple other things going on in there, so I gotta get that knee surgery taken care of. Sounds about as serious as a fucking haircut. Anyway, at this point, George has dug his heels in with regards to the contract, threatened to walk away from the UFC, and managed to keep his man firmly on a hook. It was masterful shit. The UFC were in a tough spot. Two of their bigger stars with a ton of clout were pulling in the same direction. And so, on February 27th, the UFC announced they had finally come to terms with George on a contract. 2 days later, GSP versus Bisping was announced. Just a perfect negotiation by George. People might think I'm giving him too much credit with regards to keeping Bisping on the hook, but I think George's almost single-minded focus on Bisping was entirely deliberate. Bisping's role in the whole thing was not an easy part to play. He was under a never-ending mudslide of shit. And I think it's entirely likely if George had been less committed and vocal about wanting the fight, the count may have just moved on. It would have certainly made his life a lot easier. There was one more hiccup. After the fight was announced, George informed the UFC he couldn't return till November, and this was his final condition. Dana initially scrapped the whole fight. Bisping will fight Yoel, while George will fight the winner of Maya Woodley. But this was very much like trying to close the stable door after the horse had already bolted. Dana may have been able to prevent the matchup earlier, but there is no fucking way, after giving them the fight they wanted, Dana was going to be able to roll it back. Bisping and GSP remained resolute about wanting to fight each other. And so following an especially lackluster performance from Woodley, and with few cards left to play, Dana announced GSP would challenge Michael Bisping for the middleweight belt in November. So basically, George came to the table, and gradually over the course of a year, every single one of his demands was met. He got the exact fight he wanted, at the exact time he wanted it, and under the contractual terms he wanted. So how did he do it? As far as I can tell, there's two major tactics that proved instrumental for George. Firstly, he demonstrated a willingness to walk away with no deal. As I said, in October 2016, George threatened to terminate his contract, and within 3 weeks, Dana went from saying George is not a fighter to saying, my relationship with George has never been better. The entire tone of the negotiation changed once George lawyered up and showed he wasn't going to be bullied into a shitty contract. And this is likely an idea the negotiation hammered into George's head. Demonstrate a willingness to walk away. The second thing he did was to be unequivocal about the opponent he wanted. While Bisping was booked to fight Hendo, George did field other opponents, primarily Nate Diaz. But both before Bisping signed a Hendo fight and as soon as he won it, George was perfectly clear about the fight he wanted. And this single-mindedness was brilliant in my view, because it caused Bisping to essentially stall his division despite an absolute torrent of online abuse. As we know, Bisping did not enjoy the backlash at all. Had George been more ambivalent or unclear about wanting to fight, there's every chance the count would have moved on to the #1 contender. And I think this is another lesson that was likely hammered into GSP's mind. When two big stars pull in the same direction, there's not a lot the UFC can do without financially punishing themselves in the process. GSP got everything he wanted out of that negotiation, so I'm sure the whole process emphatically reinforced the validity of those two tactics in George's mind. Now, fast forward to 2019. Right now, George appears to have only one demand: Khabib Nurmagomedov. This time he can't threaten to go elsewhere, but he can still demonstrate a willingness to walk away with no deal. And he has done exactly that, by announcing a clearly conditional retirement. A lot of people like Chael and Ariel are making a mountain out of the fact that George is finally using the word retirement. Ariel is even calling it the R word.
When you walked away from the sport in 2013 after your win over Johnny Hendricks, you always refused to say the R word. You never wanted to say retirement, retiring.
There's a lot to that if you followed his career, because he's never used the word retirement. In fact, he shied away from it.
We tried to get you to say it. You always left that door open.
You also have to understand how much he respects the word retire.
But I think you gotta read between the lines here. I mean, have you ever heard a less definitive retirement? George is using the word, but in a way that undermines any implied finality to the term. He hasn't said he'll never fight again. In fact, he said, never say never.
Do you know for sure that this is the end? Will you never fight again?
Listen, you never say never for anything, but...
He's saying things like, I don't know where I'll be mentally, the state of mind of my life in a few months. Faraz was on with Luke Thomas, and he said George was not entirely settled on retirement. To which Faraz advised him, you can always unretire.
Did you think you'd feel like this on that day?
I've made my peace with it for a long time. I've been encouraging him to retire. I've been telling him, George, retire, man. Call it. Keep your health, Number one is your health. And if one day you're so itching to fight, you can always unretire.
Faraz then appeared on a Helwani Hour and made the decision sound even more tenuous. So yeah, George is using a word, but not in a remotely committed manner. And obviously, the main giveaway was that his retirement was announced alongside another critical piece of information. George once again expresses certainty and single-mindedness about the opponent he wanted to face. Not only did he mention it, but he led with it. The media-savvy August St-Pierre almost gave his desire to fight Khabib precedence over his own retirement. Here's an interview he did with Ariel right after his announcement. And what is the first thought he expresses? His desire to fight Khabib.
Why did you decide today to announce your retirement?
We were trying to have that fight with Khabib Nurmagomedov, but unfortunately, UFC have other plan for him, and it's all good.
In fact, the first 4 minutes, the most watched part of the interview, is all about Khabib. He's doing the exact same thing here, only he's doing it all in one move. He's showing the UFC he's prepared to walk away, while at the same time trying to rope his desired opponent into the negotiation. Almost half the fucking headlines I've seen about his retirement have either mentioned or been about Khabib. He's playing the same game here. He knows if Khabib digs his heels in and they work together, they may very well present the UFC with a scenario where it's simply easier to capitulate. And George knows full well that when he announced an uncompromising desire to fight Khabib, he was planting a seed in fertile soil.
When I talked with my father 1 year ago, he told me his dream fight, me versus August St-Pierre. Because I remember when I grew up, like 11, 12 years ago, when I competition in Combat Sambo Dagestan Championship, Junior Combat Sambo Dagestan Championship, he fight for the UFC title. And when I grew up, I watch his fights, all fights with my father, and he is greatest athlete who ever competed in UFC, Middleweight Welterweight Champion. And I hear about he wanna come and fight in 155, take this belt, make history, become UFC 3 division champion, Why not? Me versus August St-Pierre,
George is Abdulmanap's dream fight. He's a fighter Khabib basically idolizes and appears to have done so since his adolescence. Unlike Bisping, who was satisfied to kind of play coy and stall a division, Khabib is a far more stubborn individual and gives much less of a shit about remaining in the UFC's good graces. If Khabib gets fixated on the George fight, he may be like a dog with a bone. With Bisping, George waved a big pair of red panties in front of his face. This time George has gone out of his way to wave a dream fight in front of Khabib's. So to me it's pretty clear George really wants a Khabib fight. And as I've said, he knows if two big stars pull in the same direction, there's not a lot the UFC can do without financially punishing themselves in the process. George said, unfortunately the UFC had other plans for Khabib. Implicit in that statement is the idea that those are not necessarily Khabib's plans. The way George phrased it begs the question, what does Khabib have to say about all this? And as we've seen from his Instagram, his immediate reaction was to bend over backwards to accommodate the fight. Khabib jumped at the fucking prospect of a fight with George. But obviously, I don't know how it's gonna play out. It'll be interesting to see how Khabib approaches the subject in future interviews. I mean, he may just wish GSP well in his retirement. He's previously expressed that type of sentiment with regards to George.
Only respect. But if you guys ask me about, hey, he have to come back or no, I'm gonna say no. He's 35 years old. He already greatest athlete UFC, and why he need come back? For what?
But if Khabib digs his heels in and begins to campaign in the media, creates some momentum and a bit of a buzz for a huge super fight, I think November 2019 will very likely be a repeat of November 2017, with August St-Pierre having played the game to perfection, getting exactly what he wants.
Качается мой город, здесь до сих пор на улицах тачки трут асфальт. И тут у братьев не ради дам их борода. Ты знаешь, что объединяет наши сердца? 10 городов, ассалам алейкум, Дагестан.
This my house, my touchdown. Спроси, как дела, я скажу I sound. Hey, брат, прокачай этот бас. Где бы ты не был, дома или в гостях. Всем засыкаем и всем детям наши голоса в домах у соседей. Возьмем мы только то, что посеян. Наш рэп заслуживает быть первым. Ты пошел к ним на стрелку, значит ты не вернешься. Lexus на 21-х, пацы решают вопросы. Нам нужно мирное небо, мне важно, что будет после. Я хочу, чтобы мой сын примерял мои кроссы.